Well, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to yet another episode of More Layers. I believe we are on the 9th episode now. Now, before I really get started with anything, you may notice that a couple things seem slightly different. For one, I'm in a different background, so things might look and sound a little bit different. But you also may notice that it's just me here. Seth actually had to take a couple weeks off because he was going to be out doing things. Completely understandable. So it's just going to be me talking for this episode and the next probably. So because of that, the episodes are probably going to be a little bit shorter. So hopefully everybody understands that, everybody's okay with that. If not, please let us know. We'll probably try to work some way around it if we can, but we cannot make any promises because we all have our own schedules and we need to stick to them as best we can. So this week's episode is going to dive into what makes a good movie sequel. You can have a good movie, but if it's a movie that warrants a sequel, and the sequel lives up to the expectations, or the hype as some people say, then people will often say that the sequel might be better. But it doesn't necessarily need to be better, it just needs to be good. So I am going to look into some of the qualities of what makes a good movie sequel, as well as some examples of sequels out there that have been very well received for one reason or another. And then I'll briefly brush up on the end, or rather at the end, of a couple movie sequels or so that have not come out yet, but I'm still looking forward to because of the potential behind them. So with that said, let's get started. So the biggest thing that a sequel, I feel, really needs to do is be a continuation of the previous film. If a sequel kind of goes off on its own, as it were, especially with the story and characters or whatever, and it doesn't really connect to the previous film, then it's not really a sequel. I feel like there's got to be some movies out there that are good films, but they're not good sequels. If it was a standalone film, it might have been well received, but considering it might have been tied to a previous film that was received well, and then it claims it's a sequel to this film, but it doesn't even act like it, nobody's going to enjoy it because they want to know more about the stuff that was established in the first film. I don't really get that. So if you're making a sequel to a film, make sure it's actually a sequel. Keep the story going, keep the characters going, and make absolutely sure that you use elements from the first movie in general in order to tell the story of the next film. So the next thing I wrote down for qualities that are in a good sequel is that it dives even deeper into its core characters. This basically means that they take the characters from the first film, or at least the ones that are heavily focused on, and develop them further, give them more story, give them more reasons to do what they do, give them more motivations to do things. I feel like a good example of this is in Kung Fu Panda 2. Because not only do they continue the story of Po the Panda, the Furious Five, his teacher Master Shifu, what have you, but they use elements that were kinda in the first film but weren't really touched upon, but they took his past, which is a huge deal in this film, and used it as a great motivation for this film. They dive into Po's backstory. They show him why he kind of acts the way he does, how he ended up with the people he's with, why he's so motivated to do what he loves. And then, most importantly, it gives him the biggest obstacle in his life, which is arguably himself. See, he has to basically conquer his past in order to combat the present threat. So once he's able to surpass himself, as it were, then he can truly take on the person that basically caused all these issues that he has to overcome. Which I feel like is a great way to tell a story. It's kind of like doing like a mini prequel within a sequel, where it takes story elements that would have taken place before the first film, but brings them into the second film, and it uses them very well. So that's a good example right there. But if you have multiple main characters you got to focus on, obviously you kind of want to do something similar, but it's also a bigger challenge, because the more characters that you have, the more time you have to divide up between these characters, and that often comes at a price, because you can't go as deep as you like with each of these individual people. So having like a small, concise amount of characters that you can focus on, even like one or two maybe, can give you a good advantage in telling their story within the story. And again, Kung Fu Panda 2 does that really well. So if you haven't seen that film, obviously you want to see the first one first, then watch that one and see exactly what I'm talking about. And that'll give you a good example of a sequel diving even further into its characters and the bonds that they have. So this next one kind of applies to movies in general, but this goes especially for sequels. Every good movie needs to have a good obstacle or villain. Because if there is not much of an obstacle or not much of a villain, then there's not going to be much for our main protagonist or whatever to fight for. If the motivations are weak, then there's going to be little motivation to do anything in this film. And even if they do something epic and you're asking why the entire time, then you're going to be distracted by those issues and you're not going to be nearly as invested in the story. If the villain is not that threatening, if he doesn't pose a major problem in the story or any of those things, no one's going to show respect towards that villain. No one's going to be like, yeah, we should really be taking care of this right now. No, they're just going to be like, we can take care of him later. He's not really hurting anyone. If that ends up happening, that can destroy the whole story. So if you do not have a good villain or something to fight against, then the story is going to go absolutely nowhere, and nobody is going to really get that invested. So that is one big thing right there. You need good characters, obviously, a good protagonist, but if you don't have a good antagonist for them to go up against, whether it's a thing or a person, it's going to go absolutely nowhere. So this actually kind of dives into my next point, where for me, a good sequel will up the stakes from the previous film or films, depending on if that franchise has multiple sequels or not. And I feel a good example to bring up would be the vast majority of the MCU films or Marvel Cinematic Universe films. And I say this because we all know, at least relatively early on, that these films were building up to one big fight for all the Avengers against Thanos. So while each individual film would probably have some sort of villain in it, we know that in the end, Thanos is the big baddie. And that's what they're building up to over the course of like 21, 22 films, something like that. And they even have Thanos make multiple brief appearances in some of the films to further build up that, hey, he's on his way. He's going to be here eventually. So even if the main focus wasn't on Thanos. Each film in the MCU would kind of build up towards him, right? So you could have a brief appearance at the end of the first Avengers film where Thanos is kind of like turning around and smiling. That really set up a lot of the build up towards what would end up being Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame. Each film kind of raised the stakes further as it got closer to Avengers Infinity War, where they would go face to face, head to head with Thanos himself. Not to say that some of the sequels within the MCU didn't have high stakes of their own. But obviously Thanos was the biggest one, so that's the biggest thing they were building up towards. But I would also say that some of the trilogy films in this one big franchise also had high stakes as they went. Like a good example would be the Captain America trilogy. The big villain, the big stakes, you could say, for the first film in those three was Captain America against Red Skull, who plans on leveling cities with his explosives. So he has to not only stop Red Skull, but stop the explosives. Otherwise, a lot of people are going to die. That is a good example of high stakes right there. And then the Winter Soldier, it doesn't, at least from what I remember, it doesn't go to something of that scale, at least not in the same way. But to me, it ups the stakes for Captain America on a personal level. He finds out that his best friend is alive, but he's been brainwashed to become a mindless murderer, pretty much. So, whereas he had to fight an expected enemy in the first film, he now had to fight his best friend. Which, if anyone out there has had to do that before, where they've argued with their best friend, or they had to cut ties with them in any fashion, then you know how much that stings. You know how much that can hurt. So yeah, while the second film doesn't raise the stakes on a general scale, it raised the stakes for him on a personal scale. And then Captain America Civil War, which could arguably have been an Avengers film, because it's got the vast majority of the main characters in it, it still raises the stakes even further. Or not only are friends fighting friends. Actually, no. That is the biggest problem right there. The friends are fighting each other. They've made each other into their own antagonists, and that causes the biggest conflict in the movie. Because you don't know how this is going to be resolved. You don't know who's going to win, who's going to lose, who might even die. You don't know all these details. So when these characters that you've seen fight side by side go head to head, with all these pieces of tension building up towards a one big fight towards the end, you might feel scared. You might feel nervous. Because you want to root for everybody, but you might stick to one side because you might think that this group of characters is right, or this one is right and that one's wrong. So they make it a conflict not only for the characters, but the viewers. So in that sense, each Captain America film raised the stakes in a unique way. So that is not only a good example of stakes being built up, but honestly a very great, unique one. And obviously, originality in cinema is very difficult to come by nowadays. So when they pull something like that off, that is something that you can respect. And of course, once they get to Thanos, he is their biggest obstacle at that point. As not only does he threaten to wipe out at least half of them, but half of the entire universe. You can kind of, funny enough, understand why Thanos is doing it. Like, he doesn't want it to be overpopulated. He doesn't want too many people taking from others, whatever the case may be. But the way he's going about it is not the way to go. Just wiping out half of the entire universe with literally just a snap of his fingers, that poses a major threat. And thankfully, they used every opportunity they could in the MCU to build up how serious and important this plot line was, how tragic this was going to be if Thanos won. So the MCU films, not only did their individual character sequels raise the stakes for them, but even those films were setting up for the big sequel or sequels that were Avengers Infinity War and Endgame. So if you want good examples, watch through the MCU, aside from maybe 1 to 3 or so of them that weren't as well received, and really look into what they're fighting for, what they're fighting against, and how important those elements are. So this next one I feel is really good to bring up, because while it doesn't happen too often, when it actually does happen, it is very noticeable. And this is when a film or films will completely replace the actors portraying a character or the character itself. The reason why you don't want to do this, ever, if you can help it, is because oftentimes the replacement actor, for example, they won't usually portray the character the exact same way the previous actor did. Sometimes they have to make exceptions, and I get that. There might be reasons why a character left or an actor left, whatever has been the case in the past. But when it's not called for, when it's not needed, and they do it anyway, it generally takes away from the story, because you now have to learn about this new person portraying the character. And unless they use incredible CGI or incredible makeup or whatever the case may be, you're going to be distracted by the fact that it's not the same person. So you won't be as invested in learning about this character, because you're like, that's not the same person, so how can I get behind this character now? And the same goes for when characters themselves are completely replaced. Like if they're killed off and they're replaced by a character that the developers will think match up to the expectations of the previous. You know it's not the same character. You know it's not the same person. So now you have to take in all this new information of who this is, why they're there, and if there's a good reason for them to be there. Because if there isn't, then that'll also take away from the whole experience right there. And I feel like when I wrote this note down, the first thing that came to my mind was, I forget which one it was. I want to say the third film, maybe the fourth. But there was a Home Alone movie, like a Home Alone sequel, that replaced the main actor, but he was still called the same character. Like, he still went by the same name. But because it wasn't the same people, they're like, that's not them. Like, why did they replace these people? Why are they here? This doesn't make any sense, and now this just takes away from the experience. So that is why you don't want to do that. It just strips away from your experience of watching the movie. So then you also want to consider, like, a good example of characters kind of being replaced, or if they were just completely absent from sequels, are some of the Fast and Furious films. I found some articles or some pages that have said things like, when these characters weren't here, like the ones portrayed by Vin Diesel or somebody else, for example, then the movie would not do so well. And that's kind of to be expected, because Vin Diesel, I haven't seen, disclaimer right here, okay? I haven't really seen the Fast and Furious films up to this point. The one exception was I saw a good portion, I believe, of Hobbs and Shaw, which was kind of like a spin-off or like a side Fast and Furious story. But yeah, people had said for some of those films, when some of the main characters were left out, the movies did not perform as well. And again, that's to be expected, because if you don't have all your core characters there, at least with a good reason, what have you, then it's going to take away from the story. Especially if the makers of the films are trying to replace them. Because then you'd have to learn about these new characters, what reason there would be for them to be there. I know I've said that a couple times, but I'm just putting so much emphasis on this. Because if you do not construct a good story around these new characters, especially to explain why they're here and not the previous character, that will heavily take a toll on your sequel. So unless you can't help it at all, do not replace your characters or actors, whatever you do. So the last point, again, these videos are probably going to be shorter for a brief time, but the last point I wrote down for what makes a good movie sequel is that it doesn't just remake a previous film or films. And a good example of this happening is Star Wars The Force Awakens. Many people, they said they still liked it. They said they still got some enjoyment out of it. Maybe that just had to do with the fact that they were bringing Star Wars back finally at the time. But despite the fact that a few people still enjoyed it, the biggest thing you will often hear about The Force Awakens is that it pretty much retold the story of A New Hope. Some things were slightly different, but a lot of the story elements from A New Hope made its way into Force Awakens. The main character lives in a desert-like area. There's a robot that looks like R2-D2 to some degree that's holding important information for the protagonist to find later that will help them in their quest or their journey to find something or someone. And of course, the big factor in there is the giant orbital planet-destroying weapon that the evil side has, that the heroes must now go inside somehow to destroy. Granted, it wasn't called the Death Star, but it was essentially a Death Star but bigger. That's essentially all it was. So that's what you don't want to do. And some remakes of stories actually work, like a reboot, for example. But like with New Hope and Force Awakens, I'm talking more of a sequel that rehashes the same story of a previous film. And I feel like The Force Awakens is currently one of the biggest ones people will bring up for that. And kind of like some of the older Karate Kid films, I'm not talking about like the 2010 one here with Will Smith's son, but like Karate Kid 2, Karate Kid 3, those films. Again, they were well received by people. But I also saw some saying that the overall experience of these films slowly went downhill with each new installment because, as they put it, while it might be told slightly differently, it would still follow the same premise. And you don't want to do this because if you follow the same premise or if you just retell the same story in a sequel, people will know exactly what to expect each and every time, plot point by plot point, play by play, move by move, whatever you want to say, and that will also take away the experience. So that kind of adds on another point I want to make, is that you want your sequel to surprise the viewers. If your sequel is predictable, if it tells the same story again, if for whatever reason the story or movie is done in such a way where everybody knows what's going to happen, especially if they use commonplace cliches over and over again, then no one, or at least not a lot of people, are going to enjoy it. People want to be surprised. People want to be on the edge of their seat, wondering what is going to happen next. What is going to happen now? What is going to happen to these characters? Are they going to make it out of this situation okay? Is someone going to die? Is someone going to get hurt? Is there going to be an even bigger threat in the future than this one? Is everyone going to make it out of whatever the problem is okay? But if people are like, oh, I know what's going to happen. This character's going to do this. This is going to happen to them. We know almost exactly when in the story it's going to happen. If you use overused plot points, character tropes, whatever, and people can predict what's going to happen, you're going to completely lose your audience, and that's obviously not something you want to do. So now for a few minutes, I thought I would just kind of go down a list of sorts of some of the films out there that are sequels that have done a lot of the elements that I've listed today really well. And the first couple that I wrote down were actually Toy Story 2 and 3. Both of these sequels expanded on the main characters more as they went. They gave them motivations to do what they were doing at any given time. Like the second one focused primarily on Woody, which makes sense. He's arguably the biggest protagonist in the film. He's not the only one, but he's the most well-known, or like the primary focus anyways. Where in the first film, he just wants to be Andy's favorite, and he had it that way until a new one came in. In the second film, he has to choose whether to accept the fact that Andy is growing up and just let that happen, or just try somehow to stay in Andy's life however he can. Like, he doesn't want to be forgotten, but he just has to deal with the fact that Andy's growing up now, and there's nothing he can do about it, so he has to figure out what he's going to do once he gets back home. Then in the third film, he and everybody else has to deal with the fact that Andy has now grown up and hasn't put much focus on them because he's going to college now. So they have to learn to stick with each other and move on. So I guess a short way to kind of show what these films are was the first movie, adapt to changes, which kind of happens throughout all three. The second one, adapt to the fact that they're growing up, and then move on. And while those premises are very simple, they dive deep into these things. Like, some of them don't want Andy or whoever to grow up. They don't want to move on initially, but they learn to over time. And that is how you tell stories like this. Then another example was Kung Fu Panda 2, which I touched upon quite a bit before, so I won't talk about it too much now. But again, it continued the story from the first film. It dived deeper into the characters and why they did what they did. It gave them a much bigger obstacle, a much bigger, badder villain, and it dove into some deep issues, which the first one only did to a point. Not saying the first one was bad by any means, but everything that the first one did, I would arguably say that the second one did just as well, if not better. So another good example of a sequel doing a lot of these things right, at least for me, is Star Wars Episode 5, otherwise known as Empire Strikes Back. Now, for those who do not know, despite the fact that it's called Star Wars Episode 5, it was not the fifth movie made. It was actually only the second. Because for those of you who don't know, episodes 4, 5, and 6 were the original 3 movies made before they went back and made episodes 1, 2, and 3, and then eventually 7, 8, and 9. But you can look on a lot of websites that talk about some of the best movie sequels out there, and oftentimes you will see Star Wars Episode 5, Empire Strikes Back on there. And I think this is for good reason, because it continued the story from A New Hope. It showed Luke Skywalker growing up, improving on his skills, improving on himself as a person, a character, and as a Jedi. It showed him having to mature further, especially without his mentor there now. And of course, the biggest bomb dropped in this film was Darth Vader revealing that he was Luke's father. It's already a big deal that he's going up against this intergalactic space villain that threatens to wipe out a lot of the galaxy. But now they just up the stakes in a matter of seconds by revealing that he is his father. So now, not only does Luke, I'm saying here, need to save the galaxy and fight this villain, he has to fight his father. He has to fight his father, knowing that if he doesn't, a lot of worse things can happen to a lot more people. Now, of course, by the 6th film, he says, I don't want to fight you. But at that point, he's matured even more. But this was a big deal when this came out. This was a big reveal that I'm sure at the time a lot of people didn't expect. So from that point through the rest of the film and into the next one, Luke had something to fight for and fight against at the same time. He had to fight his dad, but he also wanted to save him. And doing both at the same time was very difficult for him, and you could clearly see that. So that is a great example right there of a movie sequel upping the stakes, upping the motivation, diving deeper into the characters, and giving them more reasons to do what they do. Now, kind of going back in the direction of Marvel films, this isn't a movie that is part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, as this came out quite a bit beforehand. But Spider-Man 2 with Tobey Maguire, a lot of people say was an improvement, or at least a good continuation of the first film. Kind of like Luke Skywalker, Peter Parker had to spend a lot of time in this movie maturing or adjusting himself so that he could be his regular self and Spider-Man. He had to deal with his issues that ultimately literally hindered his abilities, because for a good chunk of the film he wasn't able to use like his strength or sticking to walls or shooting webs, whatever. So he had to work to regain the gifts he'd been given in the first film, but he also had to mature as Peter Parker on top of that, which would ultimately help get him his abilities back anyways. And of course, this second movie was him going up against one of his mentors. I would have said it would have been nice if he would have at least been talked about in the first film a little bit more so that we could kind of expect this, but I feel like their overall performances and the way they told the story, the way they gave motivations for these characters to do what they did, it was done well. And Alfred Molina did a good job as the villain. He created high stakes, at least for the scale of the film. And of course, Peter Parker maturing as a character and as a hero at the same time in this movie. So that is why I mentioned Spider-Man 2, because of the maturity of him, the great villain, the great stakes, just a good assortment of content needed to make a good sequel. Now, the last film that I wanted to bring up today was How to Train Your Dragon 2. The reason why I put this film here is because, like Luke or Peter Parker, the main character Hiccup does a lot of maturing, especially in between the first and second film. But even as the second film progresses, especially into the third one, he has to do a lot more maturing, especially with some of the issues that happen in this film. He has to take more responsibility. He has to take better care of himself and the people around him. He has to find a way for the humans and the dragons to live alongside each other, which, given how much space they had to work with, was very difficult to do. And of course, we find out his mom is in this film, so that adds a whole new element right there, but it's a good element because he not only wants to now help his city, help his town, but be a better Viking, I guess. And one that I can really connect with is make his mom proud. Obviously make his dad proud too, but he'd been doing that ever since the first film, so that was already established. But now he's got his mom back, and he wants to make her proud too. So that is something I can really get into. But I also thought of How to Train Your Dragon 2 because it really expanded on a lot of things. It expanded on the characters, it expanded on the world, and it expanded the story in general. It gave us a bigger threat, both literally and metaphorically. It gave us a whole new set of dragons to look at. And of course, it gave us this... No, I already said that. Okay, so it gave us the antagonist that was a lot bigger, again, both literally and metaphorically. It expanded upon the worlds, making them bigger, making them more worthy of exploration, more interesting, more investable. It gave us quite a few new dragons while still keeping the primary focus on the main dragons that are now with these humans. Like, the way they tell this story, as well as the story throughout the whole trilogy, it's just so well done. It's so well put together. All these elements keep getting bigger and better as the movies progress. And I don't know how they did it, but they made Toothless even more adorable. I don't know why that's relevant, but I felt like I had to bring it up because to me, it added to the experience and it just made me love the whole movie even more. So I guess in a way that could kind of be a good example of them diving deeper into a character in their own special way. So props to them with not only making the main character mature, but also all the other main ones to some degree. So really, How to Train Your Dragon 2 is probably one of the biggest sequels I will come back to watching. Probably that and Kung Fu Panda 2, along with some other ones that I'm probably forgetting right now. But yeah, I recommend seeing Kung Fu Panda and How to Train Your Dragon and then watching their sequels. I promise you, you will not be disappointed. So I think I'll close today with a couple sequels that haven't come out yet, but I am very much looking forward to. And I think that's also a good sign of a sequel, is that people are excited to see it even before it's come out yet. Even before it's in theaters, even before it's on a streaming service, even before it's on DVD, whatever. I feel like if you can make somebody excited for a film that hasn't even been released yet, you've done so many things right. At least for the individual's opinion, whatever the case may be. So, one of the two films that is a sequel that I'm looking forward to is Venom 2, otherwise known as Venom Let There Be Carnage. Partially because I just overall enjoyed Tom Hardy's performance as Eddie Brock / Venom. Like, he made me like the character more so than I already did. The overall story, some people found it a bit divisive, especially when comparing it to the comic book miniseries that it was based on. But I enjoyed the story. I enjoyed the characters. And of course, the plot point that they dropped at the end, which set itself up for a sequel, is finding Cletus Kasady, who would eventually in the comics become Carnage, saying, when I get out of here, and I will, there's going to be carnage. So you could expect that if and or when they made the sequel, that Carnage was going to be in it. And many people like Carnage, or at least seeing Carnage go up against Venom to see how it all plays out. So I think that's a good sign too. If the sequel is warranted, if a sequel is needed, or if it's called for, if you use the first film, or at least like the last few minutes, to kind of set up for the next one, while still keeping the first movie intact, then you've got something good on your hands. The first movie was very good, and it literally only set up the sequel in the last minute or two. But because of that, many people were hoping for a sequel so they could see how this story was going to continue, how Carnage was going to be involved, how his duel with Venom, his inevitable duel, is going to play out. People are going to want to see Venom go up against Carnage. That's probably, at least hopefully, going to be the biggest highlight of the film. That's what they've been building up to in the first film, and at this point, a trailer has come out, and we've gotten to see what Carnage looks like. So we're now starting to get very excited to see how this will play out. So that's one example of a sequel I'm looking forward to. The other, if you can't tell, is Sonic the Hedgehog 2. Like with Venom, this movie took the last few minutes, while still having it make sense to happen in the first film, to set up for the second one. Because a new character was added, the main villain was hinted that he was going to return at some point in the sequel, and they use those two plot points to really build up excitement for the second movie even before the first one was over. And I'm already a big Sonic fan, so I'm already excited for it. I can't wait to see what they do with it. And I'm trying to avoid as many spoilers as I can. But yeah, seriously, the way that Venom and Sonic both set up their eventual sequels that'll come out by the end of this year or at some point in the next, the way they did it makes me excited for the sequel. And if it makes me excited for the sequel, even before the sequel has been made, then that's a good sign, or at least promising, that the sequel itself is going to be good. This has been proven wrong with other film franchises before, but the way these first movies were done, I am very excited to see what they do in the second film for both of these franchises. So I believe that's all I had for you guys today. Thank you so much for tuning in to More Layers Episode 9. Please message me and or Seth on sequels that you think were done really well, or sequels that you think are going to do well that haven't come out yet. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or you have conversation topic ideas, or what have you, please feel free to contact us. We're on Facebook. Obviously, we have the YouTube channel. If you want to listen to an audio-only version, you can go to Anchor or Spotify. And I also want to take a moment to appreciate you guys for understanding that this episode and the next one are probably going to be a bit different, but that's only because it's going to be just me. Seth has to take some time off for other things, and I completely understand. So with that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Let me know, or rather let us know, what you would like to see in future episodes. And if you have anything you'd like to say about what I said today, or want to add to any of it, feel free to do so. I'd be happy to hear from you. So thank you guys again, and I'll see you next week for episode 10.